So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us on our second Sunday webinar. In these distressing times, these webinars are an attempt to keep members of ThinQ thinking, and also hopefully to offer something of value to those of you who have taken out time to come and watch this today. Today, we are going to talk about how we can investigate questions about the past. What is it that historians really do? How do they figure out what happened 10, 20, 50, 1,000 years ago? So recently, when a 5-year-old girl we were talking to refused to believe us when we said that there was a time in the world where there were no smartphones, we took the bait and we said we would try to come up with a convincing argument to make her believe what we're saying. So how can we begin? Madhav, Mo, would you like to?
How do we start when we ask the question, how do we know that there were no smartphones saved? That there was a time without smartphones saved in the 1800s or in the 1900s or whenever that is? Well, one thing is that if we Google it, you find a suggestion which says that smartphones came into existence at some point, right? It probably is at the top of Google or something like that. What does that tell us? It tells us that, at least according to one source, which we have access to, they have concluded that smartphones came into existence at some point. Okay, so what else? What else do we know? How do we know that there were no smartphones? If you read newspapers or read things from before, let's say the late 1800s, early 1900s, you don't see mention of smartphones, which you would expect to see if there were smartphones, right? Because these are things which are mentioned pretty regularly today, and hence you would expect that to be the case earlier. There's various other things. For instance, we didn't have, if we believe that we didn't have batteries in 1900 or in the 1800s, then it's unlikely that you have smartphones without batteries, right? Yeah, so there are certain prerequisites which are required for smartphones, silicon chips and so on, which if we believe that they didn't exist in the 1800s, then we can conclude that smartphones couldn't have existed because they're required for smartphones, right? Mo, is there anything else? We seem to have lost Aditi right now, but is there anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, actually, I would like to begin with it is a 5-year-old's question, right? I want to begin with a 10-year-old and a 10-year-old's experience. As far as the 10-year-old is concerned, that child's experience has been, there were smartphones throughout that child's life. And there is no evidence to show, as far as the experience is concerned, that there was a time when there were no smartphones. So let me propose the general principle of historical inquiry. If there is no evidence to the contrary, we must believe that whatever exists now has existed throughout.
If we accept that principle, then we believe smartphones have existed always, televisions have existed always.
That's right, yeah.
And so on.
Yeah,
right?
We know that this is not true, but let's use that principle as a kind of starting point, as a kind of general principle to go by when there is no evidence. So the question would be, how would we find out what kind of sources and how reliable are the sources to correct that view and say, no, there was a time when there were no smartphones. So one could ask the 10-year-old child to ask the parents, were there smartphones when you were children? And suppose it's the father says, yes, as far as I know, there were always smartphones. And then the child asks the grandparents, were there smartphones when you were secondary school students? And the grandparent says, no, there were no smartphones when I was in secondary school. Then you can actually conclude that assuming that the grandparent is not trying to cheat, not telling a lie, which it could be, make that assumption, then at that time there were no smartphones. But you see, the difficulty here is that the child can only conclude that there were no smartphones in the area where the grandparents lived, in that, let's say, in that particular city or village. What about the possibility there was smartphones somewhere else? That's not a trivial question to address.
Yeah, so it could be the case that smartphones existed in some part of the world.
Yeah.
For instance, we know that Native Americans had access to corn and tobacco and so on, but the rest of the world never had access to that.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
you wouldn't say that tobacco didn't exist if you were living in India, say a few hundred years ago.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So similarly, it could be the case that some people very far away had smartphones in the 1800s. We just didn't know about it.
Yeah.
Right. So how do we go about addressing that?
Yeah. Actually, that's a nice example, because until I was about 20 years old, I had never seen corn.
Okay.
So, but I couldn't have concluded that corn didn't exist until I was 20 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we can rely on. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. I was just saying how we could deal with that is, for instance, try and ask people who you think have traveled a lot, right?
Yeah.
So if they travel to many parts of the world in their lives, then that person is more likely to have seen a smartphone if it did exist in that part of the world, right? So that's one way of.
Yeah, but even then, suppose a 10-year-old child asks about, let's say, 20 people in his village or city, and they all say that there were no smartphones when they were children, or they had never seen people who had, they had seen people who repeatedly said there were no smartphones in their childhood. Mm-hmm. That still doesn't mean that smartphones didn't exist in some other part of the country, some other part of the world, in fact.
Yeah, so that's why I was suggesting that you talk to someone who's traveled the world, right? So if you talk to someone who's traveled to various parts of the world, and they don't see that smartphones exist, they haven't seen smartphones.
That is true. The probability increases, but you cannot rule out the possibility.
Of course.
That in some other part where these people didn't travel.
Yeah, so there could be some remote part of the Amazon where people haven't been to, where there's some small tribe who has smartphones.
Exactly.
I don't know. But it increases our belief that smartphones didn't exist.
Yeah.
Right?
So the general principle is, as the sample size increases, our confidence increases.
So it's not necessarily just the sample size. I guess in a sense it's the it's the quality of it's also the quality of the sample, right?
Yeah.
It's both of these things.
The variability.
Yeah.
Different kinds of travelers. Yeah.
In this case, we are relying on, say, the verbal testimony of people, right?
Yeah.
But we're saying
spoken
that
testimony.
Spoken testimony. Sorry.
Yeah.
Spoken testimony of some people, and then we will say that, however, the spoken testimony of some people might be more reliable than that of other people.
Yeah.
Given certain factors.
Yeah.
Right. But even spoken testimony has its downsides, right? How do we know that the person is not lying? Or even if we ask 20 people who have traveled the world, how do we know that they are not lying to us? That they have not decided to lie together about this question?
Yeah. So it could also be that it's some sort of like a state secret, right? So if for instance the government has decided we are not going to release the concept of smartphones to the public, but the government has it, you wouldn't be able to. No one would tell you that smartphones exist, and they would be compelled to lie, right?
Yeah.
Any government servant or something like that would be compelled to lie. So there is still a possibility that they existed, but there was
But the probability keeps reducing in all these cases.
Yeah. So what we're kind of doing is, when evidence comes together and points at the same thing, then you start believing that the thing that your statement is true, right? You're pointing evidence at different points.
So we talked about the child's experience. We talked about the spoken testimonies from the elders.
Yeah.
And now you could also add written testimonies. So if you look around all the newspapers and then you find there is no reference to smartphones in any of the newspapers, like say 50 years ago, had smartphones existed at that time, you would have found some reference to smartphones in some of the newspapers or some letters that people have written.
Yeah, so because you do see like new smartphones releasing and so on constantly now. There's events and so on. You would expect that these events also would have existed.
Yeah.
Of course, maybe it could be the case that there weren't events for smartphones at that point, meaning the advertising industry wasn't as big. So it could be the case that people just release smartphones without events and without press releases and stuff like that. But of course, once again, this just adds more evidence.
Yeah.
So if we do find written records of there being smartphones released in newspapers from the 1800s, or references to smartphones in literature written in the 1800s, and so on, that would be a good reason to believe that smartphones did exist then, but we don't find any of that evidence, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it is asymmetry. For example, if you look at the newspapers or literature, non-fiction, etc., written about 10 years ago, you find references to such things. But if you look at the fiction written 50 years ago, you find that those references are absent. So it is the asymmetry between those two that increases our confidence that during that time there were no smartphones.
Yeah. So I would like to add in one more dimension, which I had mentioned earlier, but I think it's important to bring back in, is prerequisites. So for something to exist, so let me give you a prerequisite that for smartphones to exist, humans have to exist. For smartphones to exist, electricity has to exist. For smartphones to exist, batteries have to exist, right? So if we can come to a conclusion that there was a time when batteries, lithium-ion batteries or whatever was created, then we can conclude that smartphones had to have come into existence after that point of time, right? Similarly, if telephones didn't exist, it's unlikely that smartphones existed, right? So these are all prerequisites. Telephones may not be exactly a prerequisite in the same manner as silicon.
Yeah. Electricity, definitely.
Electricity, silicon chips, and so on.
But notice that once again, exactly the same questions arise in the case of electricity. If you say that electricity, human-made electricity, did not exist until before a certain time, you have exactly the same questions.
Yeah. So once again, so in fact, we can keep taking that back, right? Because we can ask the question. So electricity, we can ask the question about the components which go into distributing electricity. We can then go to the question of humans, and did maybe before that you want to say manufacturing, and then before humans, then the Earth, and smartphones,
right,
are, at least the smartphones we see, the Earth is a prerequisite for those smartphones. Maybe there's smartphones on other planets, but the smartphones we see, the Earth is a prerequisite. The solar system is a prerequisite. The universe is a prerequisite. I miss life. Life is a prerequisite.
Yeah. So what we're trying to say is that for smartphones to exist, all of these things that you just said had to have existed.
Yeah.
And we can ask the same questions about when those things came into existence, but for now we'll that it is possible to investigate the past of those objects as well. But right now we're doing that in the case of smartphones. You can do that in each of those.
Yeah. So what this tells us, just to reiterate, what this tells us is that we can narrow down the time horizon of when smartphones came to exist, right?
Yeah.
So if we believe that the universe came into existence, at least the visible universe came into existence 13 billion years ago, whatever, then smartphones did not exist before 13 billion years, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, the Earth, 3 billion years, smartphones didn't exist, 4 billion years, whatever. Life, 3-4 billion years, life, humans, few 100,000 years, then whatever. So you know that, and electricity, human-controlled electricity, 100 years, 150 years, and so on. Silicon chips, 40 years, and so that decreases the time. Right.
So
We can narrow down when smartphones came to exist. And then what things come in are things like what Mohan mentioned earlier, that newspaper reports of events. And one is that newspaper reports of events which show that which do not mention smartphones when they should have. The other is newspaper reports of events claiming something like, this is the first smartphone, right? So you have the release of the first iPhone, for instance. There were things earlier, but that is a big event when people said, oh, this was a big, the first smartphone, whatever.
Right.
So,
like the report. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, what I was trying to say is that we're trying to figure out when certain events were more likely. So now we're trying to say that it is, given these conditions, it is more likely. We're still not completely certain about our conclusions, but we're just more confident, like Madhav said, about the time frame in which things happen. And
we're doing science here, right? We're trying to come to a conclusion about the real world. That you can never be completely certain about anything. You will always have some doubt, and that's an important thing for everyone to recognize.
Yeah, but in all these cases, I think the real issue is given a proposition and its negation, given that smartphones existed all the time, and the other proposition, smartphones did not exist all the time, they came to exist only at a particular point of time. Which of these two propositions do you believe? Not that any one of these propositions is absolutely true with total certainty, but which of them is more probable? In legal terms, which has greater probative weight is the only question that we can answer in all historical inquiry.
I mean, not just in scientific inquiry, just generally, because you are choosing between different alternatives, and all you can say is that this is the best alternative for now, and we might change our mind later on.
But there is that idea that all else common, we tend to lean towards one alternative than the other. So, for example, we say innocent until proven guilty.
That's right.
So until we find evidence show that we need to believe that smartphones existed, here we are assuming that smartphones didn't exist.
No, we are assuming that smartphones, right? Because what we are appealing to is what's called the homogeneity principle. This is the sort of thing used by Einstein and Newton and so on, to say that the world here and now is exactly the same as the world there and then.
Yeah, but we believe that only in the absence of evidence either way, right? If there is no evidence at all, then you believe that, whatever is true for here and for now is also true about then and there. Now we find evidence against that position.
Yeah, that's what we're looking for.
That is how we proceed.
So in the absence of evidence, we believe that.
Yeah.
So this is similar to, say I'm somebody living on an earth who's never, who's say I'm a 5-year-old. What should I believe about the earth being flat or the earth being round, the earth moving or the earth being stationary?
Yeah.
Without any evidence and without any arguments, the right thing to believe is that the earth is flat and stationary.
Absolutely.
It's only when we get evidence and arguments which destroy that, is that when we believe the alternative. So you start with your experience, and then you start believing the opposite of your experience once you have reason to do so, right?
Yeah.
Because there's many ways in which you can believe things are different from what they are currently. But there's but there's only one way you can believe that things are the same. And so you appeal to the one where the hypothesis is very clearly stated that things are the same. And then you try and argue for the alternative.
But notice that in all these cases, as you go from the immediate past to the distant past, things become more and more difficult. So the child can get evidence about, let's say, the father's childhood or the grandfather's childhood relatively easily by asking them the people exist. Spoken evidences, oral evidence is sufficient. But if the child is asking questions about 100 years ago, you don't have spoken evidence. You only have some written evidence. And then if you proceed further, even written evidence doesn't exist. So immediate past is much easier. So to begin with, the child has experience about what happened yesterday. But if it is what happened 25 years ago, you have to ask parents and grandparents. And then evidence becomes less and less and less. And when it comes to questions like, did humans exist? Was there a time when humans did not exist? It becomes extremely hard to come up with the evidence and arguments. So it is important that we realize that as we proceed investigating the past to more and more distant past, the evidence and arguments become incredibly difficult.
So if we have claims about 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, or even much beyond that, it's difficult. Are you saying that it's difficult to find the evidence for our hypothesis or for our claim?
Yeah, but it's much harder, right? So if you look at claims made in about human history, for instance, they tend to be pretty specific, right? They tend to be specific about some ruler or whatever. More recently, there'll be very specific claims you can make about things. The more recent it is, right? About yesterday, there's lots of very specific claims I can make. If I want to make a claim about 10 million years ago or a billion years ago, I'm not going to be able to say that this hydrogen atom was over here, right? Mm-hmm. I will just be able to make very, very general claims about the nature of planets or whatever, or the nature of stars, that stars are currently forming and so on at this point of time. I'm not going to be able to make a specific claim about one particular star or one particular planet or one particular something of that sort, right? Because the evidence there is scant.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Interestingly, if you look at history textbooks, given what we have said, it would mean that history textbooks should begin with immediate past, the past that the child has experience of, and then the past that the child's parents and grandparents have experience of, and so on. Proceed from the present to the distant past. But all the history books that I have seen, they begin with things like Stone Age. And the child has no way of questioning any of those statements. And by the time the textbook comes to the 20th century, the child is used to accepting everything in blind faith. But if you begin with immediate past, if the teacher gets up and says, why should I believe that smartphones did not exist throughout history? Mm-hmm. This is something that a child can engage with.
Or even simpler, why should I believe you when you say you came to school yesterday?
That's right. Actually, that's a much better example because there the child has experience, but the child will be able to corroborate that on the basis of somebody else.
Yeah. So some responses could be, you can ask my mother, she sent me off to school.
Right.
And you can ask all my classmates who saw me here in school.
Yeah.
In the classroom.
Yeah.
And so on.
Get on the bus or something like that.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah. So this is what happens in criminal investigations. So somebody accuses you of murder, for example, last week. And it happens that last week you are not here, you are in some other city. You will find corroborating evidence, eyewitness evidence would support your position. That's what they do in law.
Right.
And that kind of inquiry is also historical inquiry, really.
So if I may just quickly put things about our smartphone discussion together, about why we shouldn't believe, how do we know that smartphones didn't exist in the 1800s? So we started by talking about how the child can talk to, how the child's own experience would lead her to believe that smartphones have always existed. And then from that experience, if she proceeds to the experience of her parents and the experience of her grandparents and gets spoken testimonies from them about the event, she might start collecting evidence that tells her to the contrary. For example, her grandparents might tell her that smartphones didn't exist. Then she could go on to investigating written testimonies. So novels from 1800s, newspapers from the 1800s don't mention smartphones. And over time, there are newspaper or magazine articles that say, hey, here's the unveiling of the first smartphone. And then you go on to today, where you have smartphone releases and so on, and all of these events are very well publicized. So there's more reason to believe that smartphones are a recent phenomenon. And then we go on to what Madhav pointed to as prerequisites, right? That for smartphones to have existed, there are certain other things that needed to have existed. And like electricity or the silicon chips that are required, certain ways of manufacturing products that allow us to manufacture smartphones by assembling parts from all the different parts of the world, and so on. And if we go even further back, we can say humans need to have existed for smartphones to have existed. And we can keep moving further back on the timeline. There are two things that I noticed that really struck me as interesting in this conversation. And one is the idea that history is a science, which the process of doing history is a scientific process. And we rely very strongly on evidence to tell us what to believe in and what not to believe in. And so my question is this: what do we do when there isn't sufficient evidence to believe in something?
Sorry.
Oh, Mo, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, when evidence is scanty and arguments are not strong, our beliefs should be corresponding, that we should have less certainty in our beliefs. We should be able to say, there is very good evidence to believe such and such is true, but if you look at such and such other things, well, maybe not. We express less and less certainty, and when the evidence becomes scantier. But the important part is this: the kind of investigation that you use in human history, in asking questions like, did such and such exist before such and such time, is exactly the kind of evidence that you use, on the strategies that you use for biological evolution when you ask questions like, was there a time when mammals did not exist? Was there a time when vertebrates did not exist? Was there a time when life did not exist? Was there a time when universe did not exist? So this is the idea of what is called big history, where the history of the physical universe, history of the solar system, history of life on Earth, history of humanity, the entire history from the present to the long distant past, all the way to the beginning of the universe, is seen as a single continued timeline history. And if children get a sense of that big history, they will see that it is the same methodological principles that they use in all these histories. And that's important.
So the notion that history is about the India struggle for independence, or history is about the Paleolithic times, or that history is about remembering dates and memorizing things, that's something that is a result of the way history has been taught in school. The real essence of history is, as the way you pointed out, is really across disciplines. So one other thing that you pointed out is that the physical history of the universe and the biological history of the universe and so on. So these are you implying that there is history in physics, there is history in biology, that there is history across domains?
Yeah.
And that historical...
And they interact very strongly. So for example, the history of metals, the history of elements, that some of the elements that the stars produced have huge impact on human history. So if you have that kind of vision of history, history becomes evolutionary history. And evolutionary changes, not simply random events in the past, but how things evolved, how the present evolved to be the way it is. You get a deep understanding of the present by studying the evolution of the present from the past. That's a very different way of looking at history.
And sorry, go on.
Yeah, that allows us to explain why the present is the way it is. That is why we should be studying history.
Right. And so, I mean, that comes from one set of examples that you mentioned. Another set of examples that I found very interesting was that of legal cases, right? When we were saying that this is what happens in court cases, where you investigate the past and you try to establish a certain truth with a certain level of confidence. And so are you saying that even lawyers do history, do historical inquiry?
Absolutely. Doctors do it. When a doctor wants to find out whether you had a heart attack 2 days ago, or whether you had, some disturbance in your brain, and they do a brain scan to find out, right? Whether you had, for example, an epileptic fit. You're looking at the clues left in the present about a past event. So doctors do history, lawyers do history. History is something that everybody does.
The lawyers, the investigators of the crime, those are the guys doing the historical inquiry. The lawyers are arguing for one side, or they're not necessarily engaging in historical inquiry. Depends on.
Well, they're doing historical inquiry, but not scientific historical inquiry. That's all. Because lawyers have the defense lawyer must prove that the accused is guilty, and the prosecution, that the accused is innocent, and the prosecution lawyer must prove that the accused is guilty. If they change their mind, they'll lose their jobs.
So they can't. They're not doing inquiry in the sense of trying to find truth.
No.
So it's a slightly different thing. But the investigator, assuming it's a good investigator, is actually attempting to find truth.
So here, I have a question. The lawyer, in some sense, would be using the evidence collected by the investigator to make an argument for whether. Is that a part of historical inquiry, or is it just... I thought both are parts of historical inquiry.
No, of course it is. But the investigator themselves is trying to make an argument, right? What the lawyer is trying to do is
present the argument.
At least in many cases, the lawyer is trying to cherry pick the bits and pieces of evidence which support their side. It's an important thing to do because you want the best case represented for whoever you're trying to represent.
So that's.
But it's a slightly different set of things to what goes on when the investigators go.
It is historical inquiry, but it is not historical inquiry to find the truth, but historical inquiry to prove what you believe should be accepted. So it's a kind of different approach, that's all. But the historical inquiry is constant for both. It's only the purpose.
We should be, the fact that this is possible, that it is possible to cherry pick evidence and to make an argument, to make a more convincing argument for one side than another, should tell us that we should be wary of what we read in history textbooks, or what we read as claims to the truths of the historical past, right? So, all right. I think that's a good point to proceed to questions. Would you like to add anything before we do that?
No, I think we can. It's already more than half an hour, right? So we should let
We've been talking.
So ask questions now.
Dish is here too.
Hi everybody. My name is Vaideeshwaran. I'm called Dish. Perhaps I'm called Dish because I needed to appeal to the millennials, or I'm called Dish because I was an amateur radio operator in the past. I had a 3-letter call sign, and I used to talk in dots and dashes, and Dish fitted in very well. One of the things I'd like to point out is that we have already got enough questions for the rest of this webinar, but please do not hesitate to ask more questions. We'll try and group them and try and cover as much ground as possible. But if your questions are not answered, please be understanding, or if your questions are not aired, please be understanding. And I also request the panelists to be very brief, to the point, and succinct. Right? I'll start off with the questions pertaining to the smartphone itself. There's a question from Anjali Nair, which goes, what about auxiliary evidence? Smartphone brings with it certain other allied changes. One can look for signs of these changes too. I think we have already addressed the question, but you might like to elaborate a bit.
Yeah, so we haven't completely actually. That's a good point. We had talked about the prerequisites in that direction, the change. But there's also effects of the existence of the smartphone, which I think that's what she's pointing to. That you see, right? You see communication between people at a level which you wouldn't have seen before. You see people knowing about things a lot quicker than they would have before smartphones existed. So that there is effects of smartphones, which the existence of cell towers is, I guess, both prerequisite and an effect. But these are the sorts of things which you would see. Yeah, and that would count as evidence. All of these things would count as evidence for the existence of smartphones.
Yeah, we had a couple of questions from Arun Kumar, which went on to ask about, we can start with the process of identifying components and then work through them. To some extent, I think we have covered that already. He also refers to how we can use, we don't see certain things in newspapers around the world or newspapers in the past. So that to some extent has been addressed as well. Any further comment?
I think on that we
have already,
The next one is an interesting one from Anish Rao, which says about written evidence. What if there are fictional books which talk about smartphones? With time, it has become difficult to classify this book as either fiction or non-fiction. Makes the idea of looking at written testimony not a foolproof chain of argument. It may backfire also, I guess. I'd also like to link it up with a subsequent question, which speaks about one of the participants' challenge to actually determine whether or explain to her child that Ramayana or Mahabharata, is it fiction or did it happen in reality? Let's go on that one.
This is actually an extremely important and interesting question. I'm not quite sure that we'll be able to address that question satisfactorily in a few minutes, but we can only offer some pointers. Let me take a concrete example. Take H.G. Wells's Time Machine, which is science fiction. If you read that novel, if you don't treat it as a novel, as fiction, is it justifiable to believe that Time Machine existed at that point? Well, one way of finding out is to read other books and newspaper articles and see if there is any corroboration. And you find that there is no corroboration. Then you look at science. The physics at that point had no way of building time machines. In fact, even now, we don't have a way of building time machines. So is it probable that time machines existed at that time when we don't have time machines even today? So what we need to do in such cases is to look at independent evidence of various sorts, sift through evidence, and put them together to arrive at a conclusion. And the same thing would apply to stories in Ramayana, Mahabharata, mythologies, all that stuff.
So to add to that, so if you look at, for instance, science fiction from the 70s, 80s, 90s, Star Trek, for instance, you see what look like smartphones, right? On the holodeck, Picard has a smartphone.
Right.
It looks exactly like a smartphone, and you can do stuff with it. But that itself, of course, that kind of points to maybe there were smartphones at the time. But of course, then we have to look at corroborating evidence and we can see that everything else points in a different direction.
Yeah.
So even though it is some evidence for the existence of smartphones at the time, because otherwise you would have to assume someone imagined it. So which is possible, but of course
it'll be uncanny. for someone to have done that.
So of course, it increases your evidence a little bit that smartphones existed at that time. But of course, everything else pulls in the opposite direction. So therefore, we reject that.
And it'll be very hard to explain why those technologies do not exist now. If they existed some point in the past, how come we don't have them? How come those technologies disappeared? It's not like the typewriter technology being replaced by a computer, word processing technology.
Mm-hmm.
So, it is possible to put pieces of evidence together to arrive at a good conclusion. But this is not always easy.
Yeah.
Perfect. Let's move on away from the smartphone per se to the reasoning and the approach that we used in the context of the smartphone. There was one very early comment from Arun Kumar, who had actually drawn the connection between historical inquiry and scientific inquiry, even before we had elaborated on it. He says that it has to be rational, sane, demonstratively logical, and historical inquiry is, in essence, a scientific inquiry.
Yeah.
So I guess we have already covered that to some extent, but I thought it's worthy of mention.
Yeah.
The one point, interesting question that came up from Anish Rao is, I think the line of reasoning to answer smartphones were not present forever will be similar to answer for a paraphrased question. At one point, there were no humans.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah.
So same thing, going all the way past. There were no atoms, there were no whatever, the same strategies.
There's a general pattern of question.
Right.
It's a question of what you might call existence.
Yeah.
You can ask the question, does X exist? You can also ask the question, did X exist before a certain time? And that question is, did smartphones exist before a certain time? Did TV exist before a certain time? Did radio exist? Did, let's say, banks exist? Did formal education exist? Did humans exist? Did primates exist? Did mammals exist? Did vertebrates exist? All of these are historical inquiry questions. They all have the same characteristic. Did X exist before a certain time?
Mm-hmm.
And the way you answer the questions is also that there is a general similarity to all these answers.
The pattern of the process of finding specific evidence and putting that together might be slightly different depending on what you're investigating. Yeah. The pattern will be the same.
Yeah.
Great.
So something like, did the use of turmeric exist during prehistoric times? Obviously, you cannot use written evidence.
Yeah.
But you can use chemistry to find that kind of evidence from archaeology and evidence of that kind, like pots and little traces left in pots and utensils and so on.
Yes.
There is a question from Lakshmi Gandhi which says, you mean you begin the argument by contradicting the claim? Just thought this may be a good hook to talk about the null hypothesis and what is the process that we adopt to actually inquire.
So in some situations, we start with saying that whatever claim that we're making is not true, right? We make that in the situation where the opposite to the claim is what should be believed in the absence of evidence, right? This is analogous to what statisticians call the null hypothesis, which is what you believe in the absence of evidence, right? And so let me give you an example. Suppose I say that width of eyebrows correlates with mathematical ability, right? What should I believe about that claim if I don't have any evidence either way? I should believe that claim is false, right? Because there's no good reason to believe that there's any relationship here, right? So when you have a question like this, one direction is the direction which is what you should believe in the absence of evidence.
Let me just clarify one thing for the viewers. It may not be clear what it means. So let me put it this way. There is no evidence to believe that there is a correlation between eyebrows and mathematical ability. And there is no evidence to believe that it is false.
Yeah.
There is no evidence either way. And if there is no evidence either way, what should you believe? Then you believe the null hypothesis, there is no correlation. I hope that is, yeah.
And so what should the investigation be with relation to the null hypothesis? Should I try to prove that if I believe that the width of the eyebrow has nothing to do with mathematical ability, I should believe that my investigation should try and prove that that belief is false, right?
No, so if you believe that there's no relationship, you don't need to do anything. Because that's what you should believe if there's no evidence. It's the responsibility is on the person who's making the claim that there exists such a relation. That is true, because right now there's no reason to believe. There's no either other theories which predict this or anything which we would point to think to believe this direction. So we believe the opposite.
All right.
And this is very similar to the case that we mentioned, the criminal court case.
Yeah.
If there is no evidence,
yeah,
then the accused is not guilty.
Yep.
Okay. Now I'm reasonably convinced, so I'll stop working on my eyebrows from here and after. So moving on to the next question by Priyaki Kanikar. Is it always possible to corroborate your explanations to something? So for example, if you went to a distant place from your house and no one knew about your visit, you don't have any pictures to claim your visit. This again takes me to the previous question, which talks about the reliability of data. Where she talks about which factors account for reliability.
So notice here, actually, let me take this a little further, her question, and point to the fact that she also might be mistaken that she went there. She might have dreamt it. She might have hallucinated it. So there's no, so even at that level, even your own memories are things that you should be questioning, right? And then what we've talked about so far at various points is what you want is corroborating evidence. You want many things to come together. And the more things that comes together, the more the degree of belief in your conclusion. You should never have complete certainty, but you should increase the degree of belief in your conclusion.
But given that situation, what is the level of reliability of her conclusion that she went to a place like that? It's fairly low, right? One would say.
And we have to accept it. There might be cases when you don't have enough evidence to support your position. So imagine, for example, I was alone at home when a particular person was murdered and the police arrest me. And I have no witnesses to support my claim, to corroborate my claim that, I was at home. If there was nobody at home, I was alone, what evidence do I have to support that position? And there are many cases in life, also in science, where that is the case. Evidence may be lacking, and the only solution in such cases is to say, well, I have less certainty for such beliefs. That's all.
Okay.
Great. Moving on to the next. There is a question from Jyoti Godavalli, which is on similar lines. So I take it that the previous response on evidences has answered her question. Arun Kumar asks, we have to show that endless regression to proof of evidence will be hopeless. It's important for kids to understand the importance of sharpening their scope of inquiry.
I'm assuming by regression, he's talking about that the prerequisite. So we assume that this is based on this, is based on that.
Yeah.
Meaning it's not what you do is it's not pointless. It's because if we come to the conclusion that any one of these things is true, then anything which requires that particular thing, we get some sort of time frame for, right? Already. So it's not, firstly, it may look like endless regression, but at some point we have evidence pointing, pretty good evidence for certain things. And so we have a reasonable degree of belief about those things. And then that allows us to narrow down the time for the other stuff.
Can I add to that? One way to prevent this endless sort of regression in terms, if, like, for example, if a child is inquiring into smartphones, and the existence of smartphones, one way to do it is to not go as far as did atoms exist, right? We assume certain things to be true at some point, and we say, given these assumptions, it is possible to say that smartphones came into existence at a certain point.
Yeah, of
The
course,
other
question those assumptions, and that should
Yeah.
be well.
Yeah, the next step would be to question those assumptions, and it's not necessary to gather evidence in response to these questions by yourself. A lot of the time, inquiry involves critically evaluating arguments that other people have made. So, for example, somebody else may have done some inquiry into the existence of the atom or the existence of silicon chips and so on, and you may say, this person has established with a fair degree of certainty that silicon chips came into existence only after a point, which is why I can believe that smartphones also came into existence after that point.
So actually, to pick up on that a little bit, this should be a completely separate webinar on an evaluation of expertise.
Yeah.
But for a second, let me just go into that. So now you can ask the question: if someone has come to a conclusion, how reliable can you, if you don't have the tools to investigate what that person's done, you don't understand the physics, you don't understand whatever, to be able to investigate it. To what degree can I believe that conclusion the person's made? And now that depends on various factors, including the quality of the expert, the quality of not the quality of the field, but the degree of reliability of conclusions in a field, and so on. Let's not get into more of that here. We can save that for a separate one.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. Sushant Devlekar, interesting question. Is history a faculty of knowledge or academia, or is it a frame our mind uses to make sense of the world and events in it?
I think the word history has been used in two different ways. Yeah. History as an academic discipline in order to come to conclusions about the past, versus history as using the word history to mean something like your beliefs about stuff. I'm actually unclear about what the second notion is.
There is a standard, the most stereotypical use of the word history is whatever is taught in history departments. Mm-hmm. So whatever is given in history textbooks. That is not the sense in which we have used the word history.
Yeah. So go ahead, Mom. Sorry.
We have used the word historical inquiry to a way of arriving at conclusions about the past, and history as the product of historical inquiry, namely the reliable conclusions, rationally justified conclusions about the past. And is that a part of the human mental faculty? Yes, humans have certain ways of arriving at questions about the past. And the academic disciplines that engage, that use historical inquiry, expand those ways of arriving at questions about the past. Conclusions about the past.
So I would actually like to just point out one thing as an aside, which we have kind of sidestepped, which was various people in history departments and even in your textbooks. There's the notion questions asked like, is X a good king? Or is Hitler a bad person or whatever? Those are now questions where value systems and so on enter. And those are no longer strictly scientific. Those are not, they involve answers to scientific questions, but they're not scientific questions themselves. And it's important, I think, to separate those questions out from the questions we're dealing with today. We're dealing with a very narrow set of questions about how do we know what is true about the past. Yeah. We're not addressing that other question today about whether X is a good king or whatever. No, X is a good prime minister.
Ethical questions, not scientific questions.
Yeah. And I want to point out that there are rigorous ways of addressing those questions as well. You can come up with good arguments to show that by clarifying your value system, by clarifying what you consider to be good and bad, to then make a case for whether what happened in the past was a good thing or a bad thing. That would combine historical inquiry with what we call ethical inquiry, which is similar, which is today what we did in historical inquiry was try to rigorously investigate the past. what we would do in ethical inquiry would be to try and rigorously investigate our value judgments and our value systems. So,
in fact, it's not just ethical inquiry. It's when you say good king, you're also talking about their abilities as a king or a prime minister or whatever. It's
sure.
even so. It's are they good at their job, which is
Sure.
separate from are they good in ethical sense,
Correct.
and which is separate from did X happen? Did they exist?
Right. So we would need to combine different strands of inquiry to answer those kinds of questions.
Let me take a concrete example. We can ask the question. Sorry?
I don't think we have the time for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
This
just want to raise the question of Alexander the Great. Was he a great person versus great king, emperor, versus whether he conquered such and such places? These are two different kinds of questions.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to perhaps the last question. It's $1 billion question. It's coming from Parna Nori, which says, using the example of the beginning of the universe, how do we know that the universe came to existence 13 billion years ago? Let's have some action on that one, as my son would say.
Well, that is going to be, it's not answerable in the next 5 hours. So the only answer would be something along the following lines. If we accept the theory of relativity, and if we accept quantum mechanics or particle physics,
and
put together, yeah,
and inflationary theory and a few other things.
Yeah. Then those theories put together lead to the conclusion that there was a beginning. But if you don't accept that, then of course, the universe coming into exist and time and space coming to exist at that point, you will not be able to answer that, ask that question.
So I would point you to a few things. Brian Greene has a bunch of stuff, a bunch of courses on these things. Sean Carroll has a podcast called Mindscape. Definitely watch that. And he has a new YouTube series which he's doing during the lockdown called The Biggest Ideas in the Universe. I think that's the name. So look at all of these things if you're interested in that question. They will be able to address them way better than us.
Perfect. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for the questions that you've posed. I'll hand it over to Aditi to wrap up the session and look forward to meeting you all in the next webinar whenever that's organized. Thank you.
Thank you, Deesh. So I'll try to give a quick summary of what we did today. We started with a very simple question that a child may ask, which is that how do we know that smartphones didn't exist in 1800? And we use that question to not only try and develop an argument for why we should believe that smartphones didn't exist in 1800, but also to try and establish what we do when we investigate questions about the past, right? So we started with how the child might use her own experience to answer this question. Then we moved on to how she might rely on verbal testimonies and written testimonies and prerequisites. We also got the concept of auxiliary evidence from one of the questions. And we basically try to establish that history is, historical inquiry is a scientific process where we try to use evidence and we try to corroborate evidence to develop a certain degree of certainty about an event happening. And so, like scientific conclusions about the past are also tentative. And we can only say that they are true with a certain level of probability and not be completely certain about them. We also touched upon the concepts of the Null Hypothesis and the Homogeneity Principle, which we invite you to investigate on your own if you're interested, and maybe even write to us. We might do a separate webinar about these concepts if there is sufficient interest in them. I would also like to point out that there were things that we didn't explore in this webinar, one of which came up a few minutes ago: value judgments about whether what happened was good, what happened in the past was good or bad. or whether certain kings or certain rulers had certain abilities and so on. Those kinds of questions are not what we spoke about today. I don't think we addressed them carefully. And another important part of historical inquiries, asking what caused something to happen. That is also something that we didn't address today, but is an important question in history. Um, um, and we also sort of pointed to how historical inquiry is a transdisciplinary thing, in that it can happen across various disciplines and across various domains that where we wouldn't normally associate school history with. That school history wouldn't give us the impression our historical inquiry. With that, I would like to conclude, and I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We hope you found this session valuable. We had a great time doing it, I'm sure. And thank you so much, and we hope to see you again next.
Can I add something?
Sure.
So we ThinQ runs a course called IIE, which is going to be starting in May. Applications close on the 1st of May. If this is of interest to you, go to think.education/IIE. Another thing is that the recordings of these webinars are on our website. So the recordings of the past two are already on our website at think.education/events. And we will be putting this one up as well. So if you can share it with people who are interested but weren't able to make the webinar today, please do so.
Yeah. So if you found this conversation valuable, if you enjoyed this, we can say for certain that you would definitely enjoy several such conversations that we have during our course, which is IIE. So be sure to check that out. And so see you next time. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.